Want to share just some thoughts with you this morning, and for my resident professor emeritus, I'm giving academic credit to someone else. So I'm not reading my profound words, but I'm sharing something that is from an article that I just really enjoyed, and it is thoughts on the resurrection. And I purposely gave you two different accounts this morning to read, and I don't know if you caught some of those differences, where one just has Mary going to the tomb, the other has four women going to the tomb. One it just talks about Simon Peter running to the tomb, and John, I just get, actually, as my wife would say, a belly laugh out of the fact that John goes to great lengths to tell the world that he ran faster than Peter to get to the tomb. And he mentions, if you didn't get it once, he mentions it twice in his account. And I guess all I can say is, even at that time, there was some friendly rivalry amongst the disciples. But when we think of Easter, a lot of times people, particularly ministers, want to go through and try to explain resurrection, of how that can actually happen. And I'm not going to do that. For you see, at the entrance to a church outside of the Garden of Gethsemane, it is called Jerusalem's Church of All Nations. There is a large sign in front warning every visitor in bold, capitalized print: no explanations inside the church. Now, why would someone put those words outside the church? Well, as you can imagine, a prayer chapel located by the Garden of Gethsemane often attracts people who want to come in and pray. And the last thing that people wanted was to have tour guides walking into the church and then giving like a tour guide explanation inside the church, thus disrupting the worship time for those who are in there. And the article that I'm borrowing heavily from says, you know what, that's probably some good advice for preachers on Easter Sunday. Preachers spend a lot of time speaking about how resurrection might be possible and plausible to the modern mind, for we live in a world where the dead stay dead, and we seldom see direct intervention in the acts of nature or the misdeeds of mankind. But by trying to explain the resurrection, we run the risk of taming a dangerous, powerful, holy, impactful mystery into a manageable and rather harmless and benign assumption. That valuable time is wasted because the opportunity now, this morning, this moment, right now, is instead to invite you and me, to invite the assembly into confrontation with the transformative presence of the living Christ. Let me use an example. We could stand outside of a jumbo jet and try to explain how something that weighs hundreds and thousands of pounds can fly through the air, or we can climb on the plane and allow the plane to take us to a new and wonderful destination. And so it is when we consider the resurrection. We can spend all of our time trying to understand, or we can board the jet and we can learn that Easter Sunday is not for explanation, it is for proclamation. We began our service with the proclamation, "The Lord is risen." This is a time to meet Jesus, the risen one who changes everything. So the central question of Easter isn't what happened to Jesus way back when, but rather, where is Jesus now for us? Or when is Jesus for us? And so Easter becomes not a matter of questioning the resurrection. No, instead, it becomes the resurrection questioning us. Who are you? Where are you? Where am I? Who am I? And what must we become in the light of the risen and conquering Christ? Preaching this morning on Easter Sunday, I'm not as interested in convincing as I am inviting. Inviting us, a mixed crowd, all of whom carry some degree of belief, some degree of doubt. We are invited to embrace the Easter experience and consent to its transformative effects. In order to connect the risenness of Jesus with the risenness of us and all creation, we have two fundamental themes. One is that Easter is now. Easter is not a date that we remember way back when. Easter is alive and is present in this very moment. And the second fundamental theme is that resurrection has consequences. Now, we often use the word consequences in a negative way. Wait till your father gets home, there will be consequences. But consequences can have deep and powerful and wonderful meaning, as we will see when we consider the resurrection. It should be noted that the early church did not observe Easter Day. Easter is kind of something of a relatively new thing in the church calendar. And the reason for that was the church celebrated the risen Christ every Sunday. They even said they met on the Lord's Day. And so remembering the resurrection was something that the early church did in its practice. And I believe that this is something that we are called back to. That Easter is now. It's not just one day on the calendar. So the resurrection is not the property of the past. It is God's future self showing and meeting us in our present. The resurrection belongs to all times, to all seasons. For Jesus is alive and is still showing up as a transforming and transfiguring presence in a world that is fraught with sin, with darkness, with hatred. Jesus is not over, and his story is not over. Easter is now. Easter isn't something that we remember. It is something that we live and breathe on a daily basis. Resurrection has consequences. Resurrection is more than an idea that we talk about or believe in theory. It is something we become. Resurrection is something that we prove in the living of our stories in faithful obedience to the God and to the Christ whose life and resurrection we celebrate. The believer's life, your life, my life, is to be a testimony to the risenness of Christ. We are to demonstrate that Jesus is not dead by living a life in which Jesus is the never-failing source of holy affirmation, of holy challenge, of holy enrichment, of love, of grace, of growing, of service. The believer shows that the resurrection is real by having Jesus as the center of his or her life. I love icons. I love the drawings of the early church. And in Orthodox iconography, basically in Orthodox drawings and icons, whenever they show the resurrection, Jesus is never by himself. Jesus is always depicted of reaching out and taking the dead by hand and pulling them out of their tombs. Christ's hand, this moment, is reaching out to you, is reaching out to me in whatever tomb that we may find ourselves in, to snatch and to pull us out from death. Some of us may be in a tomb of despair. Some of us may be in a tomb of bigotry, might find ourselves in a tomb of prejudice, or in a tomb of doubt, or in a tomb of hopelessness. It is in this where the resurrected and power of Christ reaches and says, "Take my hand." Christ came to save us from our sin, and quite frankly, to save us from ourselves. I think last week I shared a t-shirt that said, "In my defense, I was left unsupervised." And that, I think, speaks well to us sometimes, that when we are left to our own, we can get ourselves in a mess. But when we take hold of the resurrected Christ, that is our gift. That is our challenge. And the resurrection, when we allow it to come into our lives, it will transform our common and our corporate life as well as our private selves. Otherwise, it's just an empty idea. The proof is in the pudding, right? How can someone say that they follow Jesus when their actions do not confirm that? We show that we follow Jesus when we live in his love, when we live in his grace, when we let go of our pettiness and our prejudice, and we let go of the small box that we have that we insist that God must fit in. And that has been the struggle of the church from day one. But yet we see from the church the gracious first steps of evidence of the resurrection. Think about the stories of Holy Week. It is the story of people scattering, except for the women. I always give the women credit. Women, you hung by Christ and you stayed with him all of the time. Men, not so well. If you were in this morning's service, sunrise service, the liturgy of the men was pretty appropriate. The women were like, "We saw Jesus." The men were like, "Huh? What?" Summed up by one word: clueless. It was accurate, I'm afraid. But we see that they finally get it. And when they get it, they show that they've gotten it. Because all of a sudden, the community that could no longer get together is united. And it is in service. And the brothers and sisters find a holy boldness where they proclaim in word and in deed and in social justice that they follow a resurrected Christ and that their life reflects that empty tomb, that resurrection power. And so it is for all of us to follow. For resurrection is about the healing and restoration of wounded and severed relationships. Our relationship between ourselves and God. Our relationships between ourselves and our brothers and sisters. And even our relationship with all elements of creation. The resurrection is not just the resuscitation of the body, it is the beginning of the transfiguration and transformation of the world. For all creation yearns and is waiting for the sons of God to be revealed. As a preacher, you never know what someone's going to take away from your sermon. But this morning, it is my hope that we, including myself, will take away inspiration and empowerment, and that all will be intrigued and fed and find themselves spending time with a resurrection community that is alive with the Spirit. May we at Webberville be alive with the power of the resurrection that is consistently found to be loving, to be growing, and to be serving. We put that on the bulletin every week for a purpose. The primary task of preachers and evangelists on Easter isn't to recite or argue the evidence for resurrection, but to challenge themselves and their communities of faith to become the very evidence of the resurrection that they proclaim. We have a holy challenge today, a holy invitation to climb aboard that plane and to follow and allow the Spirit of God to take us into service to this community, and perhaps for some of you, to the world, through your gifts, through your very service. May the whole world see one day and know of a church that has been shocked and challenged and empowered and rejuvenated into holy bliss, holy grace, holy action, and that revels and never recovers from that shock and from that bliss. That's another way of saying, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. The Lord is risen. He is risen indeed. Let's do more than say it. Let's let that flow through our very lives beginning today.